The Linnell family home on South Lancaster Road, built about 1824, was in the family for 5 generations until 1927 when it was sold outside the family. Much more history in Dr. Chessman's presentation on the other tape. Granville, Ohio, where the third Linnell Family Association reunion was held in 1994. The name Granville appears on a building downtown. This is the main entrance to Denison University, a liberal arts college, 1831, and this plaque was evidently erected in 1931. At the bottom, this appears, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." The college had signs up with pointers, arrows, for each thing that was taking place, directing us to the Huffman Hall where we registered. This is Huffman Hall where we registered and also where the meals were served. This is from the end of the concourse or whatever it is, by Huffman Hall, looking towards Crawford Hall, where the dormitory we used and the family rooms and such.
I'm Pamela Linnell, and I have the pleasure of being the host and narrator for our family presentation. This evening, our theme is going to be the Linnell family migrations as we spread from Cape Cod all over this continent. My own Linnell ancestors were part of the family migration from Maine to New York and to the Midwest. And then my dad kind of migrated us around, so even though I was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin, now I live in McConnell, Illinois. One of my fond memories of growing up is of family storytelling. I remember sitting with my sister around the big dining room table and listening to my mom talk about growing up. I never met my maternal grandmother because she died before I was born, but I feel a connection with her because of the stories my mom told. And I remember a time in particular with my dad and my grandpa sitting around another table and laughing about some of the eccentrics who lived in Hickston, Wisconsin. So I feel a connection with the life my father had in that small town because of those stories. As long as we tell the stories, our family is larger than the current generation. We Linnells seem to have been a moving on kind of group of people. And as we moved, sometimes we forgot the stories, and we lost a lot of connections. But then Rachel's book came along. The highlight of this, the third North American Linnell Family Association reunion, is the release of the second edition of The Descendants of Robert Linnell by Rachel Linnell Wynn. This book has brought our family stories together and helped reconnect us with one another. This evening we've taken some of the pictures from this book and put them together into a family album. And we brought some cousins who can tell the stories that go along with those pictures. And there's another story too in the book itself. So along the way this evening, you'll have a chance to hear how some cousins became involved in Rachel's book project. Now, some were not born Linnells, they were made Linnells. And we heard their story a little earlier today. But the group known as solid, has assured us that they plan to sit back and relax and quietly enjoy tonight's family album. Every story begins with a beginning, and I think the beginning of the story of reconnecting with the Linnell story is probably different for each one of us. Here to share their beginnings are my mom and dad, Dick and Drew Linnell.
Prior to the publication of Rachel's first edition of The Descendants of Robert Linnell, as now shown on the screen, most Linnells lived in the bosom of their immediate family and maybe knew a few cousins who had moved away. Travels included studying phone books for Linnell names, making calls to strangers who in most cases couldn't trace the family back more than a couple of generations. No, they couldn't possibly be a relative.
When we were married and you gave me the name Linnell, I was delighted to be rid of my maiden name, Nickish, because it caused a lot of trouble with spelling and pronouncing, besides that nickname. What was I in for a surprise? In your little home area in Wisconsin, the name was pronounced Linnell. L-E-N-N-A-L, and very few people could spell it, but that didn't faze them. They insisted the correct pronunciation was Linnell, even if they couldn't spell it. What a joy to meet Rachel and the family in Barnstable and to hear them all pronounce it Linnell.
Yeah, I recall Eric Linnell telling us at the Barnstable reunion about his problem with our name. I don't remember the complete story, but it ended with, and it rhymes with hell.
And telling them in Black River Falls, Wisconsin, that some 600 homes in the USA pronounce it Linnell doesn't have any ice with them.
Well, that was the way it was, and they've been pronounced all their life, and to them it seemed that no one was going to change them. After all, Linnells had lived in that area of Wisconsin for over 150 years.
This is just one of the ways that Rachel's work has had an effect in our family.
It all began in 1981 when Rachel entered our lives. Many of you got this letter from Rachel. It started with, "Dear Linnell family member." Also enclosed was this family data sheet. Such a letter came to my dad requesting information about his family.
Dad's reaction was kind of, what does this woman really want? Wasn't it a couple of months before he actually shared it with us?
Yes, it was. When he remembered to tell me about it, I told him I would answer it for him. So I sent the info to Rachel. In a short time, a new letter arrived from Rachel, thanking me for the information, but asking for more. With her suggestions and directions, we were hooked and spent a lot of time touring the Midwest, looking for Linnells and adding to the family line. We met so many previously unknown cousins and developed contacts that have become dear friends as well as cousins.
How many of you who attended our earlier reunions have heard the story of David Linnell and Hannah Shelley, entitled A 17th Century Love Story? This story was written by Dick.
Had a great time putting that story together. It's based on historical fact, as well as supposition as to how these events affected the lives of David and Hannah Linnell. From this research emerged the picture you now see on the screen. This is David Linnell as seen through my eyes.
Why not for a moment go back to the Linnell beginnings in America?
Robert Linnell was born in England in 1584 and was in his 54th year when he arrived in America in 1638. He lived in the colonies 24 years until his death in 1662 at the age of 78.
What about David? Was he born in America?
No, David Linnell was born in England in 1627 and was 11 years old when he arrived in America. At the age of 16, young men were able to bear arms. So in 1643, at the age of 16, David enlisted in the Home Guard or militia and served under Captain Miles Standish. This, to me, brings American history right into our family. David and Hannah Shelley had some, well, problems or trouble with the church. This problem is recorded in a book entitled Plymouth Colony, Its History and People by Eugene Stratton on page 193. It's also recorded in a couple other places, and Rachel had discovered this earlier. But David and Hannah Shelley married in 1653 after a rather, we'll say, rocky romance. They had 9 known children, from whom spring all the Linnells in America. David Linnell died in Barnstable, Massachusetts in 1688/9.
Our travels have shown us how blood will tell. In Iowa, we met the daughter of a Linnell descendant we were visiting, and she was the spitting image of our second daughter, Daphne.
We even took a picture to show our daughter. Drew and I have given you just a thumbnail sketch of our family beginnings in America. The beginnings of my family through Rachel's book project have been significant and have enlarged our lives in so many ways. To the greater Linnell family and to Rachel, we owe a debt of gratitude for enriching our lives, extending our family, and allowing us to meet so many newly found cousins. Our thanks and appreciation to Rachel and JC for a wonderful, exciting journey.
As you entered this evening, you received a program, and this material will provide information about our story. You'll find an early map of Cape Cod, a map showing the migration movements of Linnells, a list of Linnell migration movements, and a list of the Linnells you will meet this evening as we present a family album. Robert Linnell and his family were part of what has been called the Great Migration to Massachusetts Bay Colony that occurred between 1630 and 1640, when some 21,000 colonists arrived from England. That must have been a big surprise to the Native Americans living here at the time. Here we see a map of Cape Cod during this time period. Note the location of Scituate way up in the corner, and Barnstable in the middle of the curve of the bay. When Robert Linnell arrived in 1638, he joined the John Lowthorpe Church in Scituate. In the fall of 1639, this church group removed to the Cape to the place they named Barnstable. During the next century, few colonists arrived from Europe and families remained in the locale of their birth and settlement. You will find that at least the first 6 generations of the Linnell family were born and or died on Cape Cod. The slide shown on the screen is in this handout. Note the family identification number in the migration movement. By matching this number with your ID number on your reunion badge, you can tell where your family line was in this migration movement. Following the Revolutionary War, the first Linnells left the Cape and went north to Maine. Samuel and several members of his family went to Gorham and Standish, Maine. And at about the same time, Joseph migrated to Belgrade, Maine. You can see their family ID numbers in the handout. In 1801, another Samuel went from Maine to Grindstone Island, New York. His children and descendants moved on to Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and North Dakota, beginning as early as 1844. A little earlier, near the close of the 17th century, several Linnell families from the Cape Cod were part of the early movement to western Massachusetts towns of Lenox, Lee, Granville, and Tolan. These families included Uriah and Joseph. Joseph and his family continued on west to Granville, Ohio in 1805. Uriah went further west to Pittsburgh, New York in 1818. His son Elijah caught the Western fever and left New York State in 1837, taking his family to Adrian, Michigan. Descendants of this line continued on to Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and Oregon. This information does not cover all the Linnell family movement or migration, but it shows the pattern and movement of Linnells in America up to the latter part of the 19th century and can help you identify your own family line. In another part of the program handout, the lists show the names and family identification numbers of the cousins you will meet in our family album this evening. Again, you may wish to check their identification numbers and see if there's a relationship with your family line. The Linnell migrations begin from Cape Cod, but not all Linnells left the Cape. Of those who stayed behind, many turned to the sea. The most famous of the seafaring Linnells was Captain Ebenezer Harding Linnell, and we hear his story as told by Mark Wynn.
This picture of the Captain Linnell House restaurant brings back a host of memories of our first Linnell family reunion on Cape Cod in 1988. A severe storm had wiped out the electricity on the Cape. Not only were we in the dark for breakfast at the hotel and for our service of worship, but we didn't know if that restaurant would be able to serve us lunch, the final celebration of the weekend. The restaurant could not get word to us because the phones were out of order. Finally, we all just decided to expect the best, found the storm abating, and enjoyed a splendid luncheon in this historic residence. The house was built for Captain Ebenezer Linnell, using the plan of a house owned by a shipping agent in Marseille, France. In charge of the construction was a master builder, Edmund Crosby, Eben's father-in-law. It was built in the 1860s and was linked to the Cape Cod house that was built on this property for Rebecca Crosby when they were married in 1835. It was a delight to Captain Linnell and to us visiting as well. The paneling and the floors were beautiful hardwood. The detail of the ceilings, the windows with the wide sills extending nearly from floor to ceiling, the curved staircase to the second floor, all showed the care and expert workmanship that went into its construction. And the gardens behind the house, with the spreading ancient trees, were being restored to the plan of over a century ago. The portraits of Captain Eben Linnell and Rebecca Crosby Linnell, along with models of the ships that he captained, brought us into the presence of this dynamic man. The age lines of the portrait of Captain Eben Linnell at age 48 shows something of the maturity of this commanding man, along with the experiences of his voyages. An early command of Captain Eben was the Eagle Wing. Here we see the vessel in its sailing majesty. The maiden voyage of the Eagle Wing left Boston December 20th, 1853. The ship survived a hurricane in the North Atlantic that was the worst that Eben had ever experienced, and it washed 2 men overboard on its way to San Francisco. From there to China in 1854. Then another typhoon on the way to London, where it required 1,470 pounds sterling to repair the ship. But Captain Linnell's profit was even greater because the tea he carried from China to the London market was so valuable. But it was on the next leg of his voyage that his reputation was solidified. It took him just 83 and a half days to sail from London to Hong Kong. The clipper ships tried in vain to best this record in the years ahead. Captain Linnell was back to New York after 2 years and 2 months, in time for Thanksgiving with his family in 1855. Captain Eben was thinking about ships even on land, and during this time at home, he invented a new topsail rig to increase performance on the clipper ships. As soon as it was patented, it was used on 64 vessels, including some of the shipwreck-built ships. His stay at home was to last for only 9 months, for in 1856, he was invited by the Chases to take command of their clipper ship, the Flying Mist. This 2-year voyage took him to San Francisco, to Chile, to the Chesapeake Bay, to Singapore and Hong Kong, to New York by way of Manila, and home in time for Christmas in 1858 at Orleans. It was while in Hong Kong on another trip at Thanksgiving time in 1859 that he gave a much-remembered ball on board ship, entertaining all the important people in Hong Kong. In 1862, in command of the Flying Mist out of London, he picked out 1,760 sheep and 18 shepherds bound for New Zealand. There he picked up a pilot to enter the bay. The ship unfortunately dragged both anchors, rammed into a rock, and became a total loss. An investigation failed to find any explanation for the disaster. Captain Even returned to the command of the Eagle Wing in 1863. On a trip to San Francisco in 1864, in a squall, he was caught in the bight of the spanker boom bang while the ship was jibing and was dashed across the spokes of the wheel. Critically injured, he lived only a few days longer. Henry Kittredge, author of Shipmasters of Cape Cod, evaluates Captain Even Linnell thus: for native ability, energy, and shrewdness, few American shipmasters were his equal. The romance of the seas can be further explored when we return to the Cape for our reunion in 1997.
There were many Linnells involved with the seas out of the Atlantic shores of the century. To name a few, Captain John Linnell was in the China trade out of Boston and New York as master of the clipper ships Industry and Gen 2. Captain Absalom Linnell was master of the packet ship Elizabeth that ran out of Boston. Captain Dean Gray Linnell was in the oyster and fishing trade. As keeper of the Nauset Light in 1857, he went to the rescue of the Orissa that was wrecked on its shores. Captain Solomon Linnell was the first keeper of the Orleans Life-Saving Station and father of Captain Ebenezer Harding Linnell. Another captain that we'd like to know a little more this evening is Captain Allen Higgins Linnell Jr. His story comes from the diary of his daughter Hattie, who accompanied her father on one sea voyage. This story was written by Bruce Campbell McGonigal, a great-great-grandson of Hattie. Bruce is unable to be with us this evening, so to present his story, we will hear from Robert Hartley Linnell of Vermont.
This family portrait was taken about 1885 by A.M. McKinney of Portland, Maine. The gentleman with the beard is Allen Higgins Linnell Jr., a sea captain, or, in the language of the sea, a master mariner. He was born in 1828 at Harwich, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, son of Allen H. and Polly Small Linnell, and a descendant of the mysterious Jonathan Linnell of Orleans. I think if I can throw an adlib, I think the reason I'm reading this is because I am also a descendant of that mysterious Jonathan Linnell. Allen's father and grandfather were mariners, as were many of the men who lived on Cape Cod. He made many sea voyages, including one on which his 10-year-old daughter, Hattie, kept a diary beginning at Cardiff, Wales, April 28, 1874, and ending in London on July 15, 1875. Hattie is my great-grandmother and is shown as a 20-year-old in this portrait. She is the second one from the right. You can see her there at the top. The 15-month voyage was a wild one, with its first leg going from Cardiff, Wales to Montevideo, Uruguay, in South America, preceding around Cape Horn to Peru, and a return voyage to London, England, all with the 10-year-old in Europe. While the diary of a 10-year-old doesn't concern itself with such things as what cargo was or what the name of the vessel was, it does reveal that bad weather would completely rearrange the furnishings of her cabin, and that the Chinese cook presented her with a small saucer, which, along with the 2-volume diary, was passed along to me by my grandmother, which we cherish as family heirlooms. Captain Linnell was married 3 times. His first wife, Amelia Berry, died childless. His second wife was Harriet Annette Tolman of Rockport, Maine. At the time of this marriage, Allen moved to Rockport and set up housekeeping with Harriet at their home in the corner of Commercial, now Pascal's Avenue, and Pleasant Street. I have visited the house and is now the residence of an architect, Richard L. Bernard, who has restored the house. Allen and Harriet were the parents of John, born in 1855, who moved west in the 1870s. Jesse Ames Linnell, born in 1858, and Hattie, that we previously referred to, Hattie Frances Linnell, born in 1863. Jesse is at the far right picture, and Hattie is second from right in the portrait, as we pointed out earlier. Wife Harriet died shortly after the birth of her daughter Hattie. Alan then married a third time, Frances Adams Tolman, at the far right in the portrait. And she had children, Clarence Adams Linnell, born in 1869, Isabel Thatcher Linnell, born in 1865. Clarence is shown standing, and Isabel sitting, both between their parents. Hattie's natural mother had died shortly after her birth, and the only mother she ever knew was her stepmother Frances, who loved her as her own. I also have the quilt that was made by Frances and was carefully handed down over the generations.
As we continue to look at our New England ancestors, we move from the seafaring men to Linnells who were engaged in other occupations. Robbie Kidder Linnell spent his entire life in Maine. His father Sturgis was born on Cape Cod and came to Maine with his father Joseph in 1781. Robbie was a farmer, minister, and circuit rider. We will hear about the life of Robbie Kidder Linnell from modern-day Robert S. Linnell of Washington State, an 11th generation Linnell and descendant of Robbie.
It was Nancy Linnell Cowan, my late sister, who found this picture of Roby that is included in our gallery. I haven't seen this picture for about 50 years, but I remember it well as a child. Roby's picture shows a strong character, piercing eyes, and a high forehead. It easily foretells the description of his great height, some 6'6" or 7. His commanding presence, along with his reputation as a restless rover, carried him into the side profession, that is, besides farming, of being a circuit-riding preacher. He preached throughout the area of central Maine. By the way, how many of us here have ever been to the great state of Maine? Have a show of hands? Okay, now, I really don't care if you've ever been to Maine or not. What I'm trying to do is get some audience participation. Because I know darn well that if you know there's a test coming later, you'll pay attention to what I have to say. Now, the family stories have not revealed what the impetus was that got Roby into this preaching business, or whether he had any kind of special education for that talent. We only know that he lived in several places in Maine, central Maine, where he established his family on a farm and then would go off and leave them and carry on his preaching missions. Roby Kidder Linnell was born December 19th, 1802, the oldest of 5 children in Washington Township, Maine, which is now known as Belgrade. This is some 30 miles north of Augusta, the capital. In those intervening years, his grandfather had purchased the first of the family holdings there in Belgrade, and his father Sturgis had fought in the War of 1812. Then Sturgis inherited the Linnell farm at Belgrade, where he cared for his parents in their later years. Now, Roby married Charlotte Clark in 1833. Charlotte died some 23 years later, 1856, after 23 years of marriage, which she lived in Belgrade, and they lived in Belgrade and Skowhegan, Maine, had farms there. And during this period of time, they had 7 children. In 1859, following Charlotte's death by about 3 years, Roby married Lois Goodrich Norman. She was the widow of a sea captain by the name of George Norman. Now at the time, this is important, at the time of this marriage, Roby was 57 and Lois was 37. Lois bore Roby 4 more children. The youngest having been born when Roby was 66. This was in 1868, and 1868 was also apparently the year that Lois discovered the pill. Because after that were no further descendants of Robert Linnell sighted by Roby. Now let me just digress briefly here. You've got to see the whole picture. During this time we were involved, of course, in the Civil War. Roby was nearly 60 when the war broke out. And so he was just a mite old to go marching through Georgia with the Army of the Potomac. But as we have seen, he did manage to keep himself occupied. Now, General Joshua Chamberlain, who was the commander of the 20th Maine Regiment, and according to some historians, if it were not for his gallant leadership at Little Round Top, the Union would have lost the whole war. If this is of any interest to you, this coming Sunday evening on national television is going to be a movie called Gettysburg. And I commend it to your attention if you want to find out about George Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. And I'll bring this back into Roby in a minute here. General Chamberlain, following the war, returned to Maine and was promptly elected governor. And why this could have been important to the Linnells, I'll bring out shortly. Seems that Roby's second wife, Lois, had a brother, Eben Goodrich. And darned if Eben didn't up and marry Roby's oldest daughter, Charlotte. Now, rumor has it that then Governor Chamberlain was tempted to convene a special commission down there at Augusta in the Capitol to review the Maine laws concerning incest. Because as you can see, when Eben, Lois's brother, married Charlotte, then Charlotte, Roby's oldest daughter, became his sister-in-law. Now, this sketchy information begins just to tell the story of Roby Linnell Kidder, Roby Kidder Linnell, but those who could illuminate the subject matter, of course, are long gone. We would like to know more about his circuit riding and his preaching, what got him started in that, how it progressed. We'd like to know where the name Roby came from, where the name Kidder came from, because that only shows up twice, in him and in his son. And why did Roby Jr., his son, change his name from Roby Kidder Linnell to Kidder Roby Linnell? We just don't know, and there's no record.
He's trying to be a member of Solid.
Now, as to his name, I can only speculate. The name Roby. Probably Sturgis, who was his father, and saw the obvious benefit to having a son named Robert. But his wife, Lydia, perhaps wanted a Bobby, and maybe they settled on Robbie. But that just can't be true because it was definitely pronounced Roby. And I had an aunt, you might have heard of it in the Minnesota Convention, Bertha Roby Linnell. There's no question from my recollection of her, but the middle name was Roby. Now, the answers to these questions and many others may be lost forever. And this is just because they weren't written down, passed down from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, as they should have been. I hope that we don't make that same mistake, and with the publication of Rebecca's book, I think we're on the right track. Well, as Lady Godiva was heard to say as she neared the end of the famous ride, I think I'm coming to my close. In so doing, let me make one awesome observation. I didn't have time to use the calculator, so I can't guarantee the accuracy of these figures, but as near as I can figure from the book, if Roby had gone off to fight the Civil War and hadn't stayed at home to tend to business, there would be 871 fewer descendants of Robert Linnell in the world today. I want to thank you, Roby.
Not all Linnells who lived their lifetime in New England states went to sea or earned their living from the soil. John Wesley Linnell was one such individual. In the late 19th and early 20th century, he was a Massachusetts businessman, entrepreneur, and manufacturing executive. A successful man, he lived in Victorian splendor. To tell us about John Wesley and his lifestyle, we hear from his grandson, Jack Linnell of Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
My grandfather, John Linnell, was born December 18, 1864 in Pawtucket, Massachusetts. One of 8 children, the only ones I knew were Arletta and Vesta, his sisters. They moved to Malden, Massachusetts. He married Mary F. Robinson of that city in 1886 and had 2 sons, and Roger in 1887 and Robert, my father, in 1892. He worked in the insurance business and was superintendent of the Potter Drug and Chemical Company and the manufacturer of Cuticle soap and home remedies. Grandfather and grandmother moved to Boston. My father and mother married, moved to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where I came on the scene. They were in an apartment in Pawtucket. In Boston, my grandfather and grandmother lived on Commonwealth Avenue in a huge 4-story brownstone stone house with a kitchen in the basement and a dumbwaiter coming up to the pantry where the maid received it and served dinner. And in 1928 or 1929, I don't know which it was, my grandfather had a heart attack and was treated far differently from the way people are treated today. He stayed on the 2nd floor where his bedroom was, took his meals there, took 2 rides a day, morning and afternoon. Then that was his life until his death in 1943. The only times I saw him were Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving. My dad went up every Sunday, and my mother and I on these 3 holidays. On the 3 holidays, my mother, Uncle Roger, my father, and myself would have dinner. Granddad was upstairs in his bedroom, and we ate up there. He didn't come off from the 2nd floor. About 2 o'clock, Aunt Letty and Aunt Vesta came for dessert. While we were having dessert, an awful bang would come out of his bedroom. He tossed a firecracker in a tin wastebasket back there. And he's trying to surprise everybody, but everybody knew it was coming, so it was no surprise. He died in December of 1943 while I was in service. I really wish that I had known him better because I'm sure he was a perfect gentleman, as was my father. And today made me think of him because he had a little saying that he used to say in a lot of different occasions when people complaining about weather. Now, ever since I've been here, people say, oh, it was so hot, it was raining, so forth and so on. He used to say, whether it's cold or whether it's hot, we shall have weather, whether or not. That was his biggest thing. I'm sorry this story is not quite as exciting as some of the others, but my mother and Barbara and myself, we all thought we were the only Linnells around. Until around 1981, we got the letter from Rachel. The same as Dick did. So we had a few records and we sent them to her. And a little later said she would like to have a reunion on the Cape and was going to come down to look around and see what she could find. So we suggested that we me meet her in Sandwich for lunch. And we met, she and JC, and we had a sandwich together and talked about the reunion. And that got me started, got Barbara started. And it was a wonderful experience. I've enjoyed it ever since.
Rachel's search for Linnells had brought around about many touching and unusual stories. One such story is that of James Crosby and Martha E. Linnell. Contact with James M. Linnell of Missouri revealed a family line Rachel was not aware of. James writes about Rachel's letters, the discovery of his line, and about James Crosby and Martha. James is unable to attend the reunion, so his story is brought to us by Dick Linnell.
As Pam mentioned, this was written by James M. Linnell from Missouri. I have been asked by the cousins what I know about James Crosby Linnell and his wife, Martha E. Linnell, my great-grandparents. Additionally, I've been asked to discuss the connection between Rachel and myself, or how that connection was established. After the death of my father, Orville Guy Linnell, in 1976, I came into possession of a box of stuff that had been passed into my father's hands after the death of my grandfather. The box contained family pictures, many short notes on the back, many with short notes on the back, letters from my great-grandparents, and my grandfather's writing of what he knew about the family history. Eventually, I came into the possession of a book entitled Illustrated History and Biographical Record of Linnell County, Michigan. The inscription on the flyleaf showed that the book was a Christmas present in 1907 from James Crosby Linnell to his son, James Arthur Linnell, my grandfather. According to James Crosby's biography in the book, James Crosby could trace his ancestry back to Robert Linnell. Upon examination of this book, two things were certain. First, everyone in Leone County was well esteemed, had been eminently successful, was extremely devout, and had a flawless pedigree. Secondly, according to the pictures in the book, no one, and I mean no one, knew how to smile. This box and this book and box of stuff were put away in a dark corner until June of 1981. In the midst of preparing to move to St. Louis, Missouri, there came a letter from one R.L. Wynn. It was a form letter along with a questionnaire. Rachel was trying to obtain information so she could link the various Linnell families that she had been able to uncover through her work on the family history. Although I did not know it to be a fact, I assumed that Rachel had come across my name and address in a telephone book. I dug out the box of stuff, dusted off the book. If this woman wanted to know about Linnells, I'd tell her. One of my brothers was convinced this was one of those $29.95 scams and I shouldn't waste my time. The only thing this woman was going to do was send me a list of names from Linnell names from phone books across the country. But I did fill out the questionnaire, copied the information from the book and other items found in grandfather's papers, and sent them off to Rachel, including this photo of James Crosby and Martha E. Linnell. After responding to Rachel's letter, I brushed up on my ancestry. James Crosby was born in Pittsford, New York in 1834. His father, Elijah, moved to Adrian, Michigan in 1837. James Crosby was a farmer until about the age of 30. At that time, he became a commercial traveler, reported to have visited all the then existing states. Now, according to a note on the back of a picture, in his prime, he could have doubled for U.S. Grant. In his later years, he could have doubled for one of the Smith brothers on the cough drop box. James Crosby married Martha E. Hard in 1859. My grandfather, James Arthur, was their fourth and last child. He studied osteopathy in Kirksville, Missouri, and they're married in 1904. The family later moved to Illinois, where my father was born in 1911 at LaGrange, Illinois. After having responded to Rachel's letter, I didn't think much about Linnell until a second letter arrived. This was it. This woman was asking for $29.95. The letter was somewhat of a letdown. She wasn't asking for money, at least not yet. Instead, the letter said I was a branch of the family that she was not aware of, and that she had found the graves of my great-great-great-grandparents, Uriah and Thankful Crosby Linnell, who were buried in the Pioneer Burial Ground in Pittsford, New York. At least this explained the origins of the name Crosby in my family line. Finally, the day arrived. A letter from Rachel asking for her $29.95. The woman had worked for it, so why not order the family history? As you know, the history was well documented and well worth the price. Or was it? I glanced through the book. I found out that I was a 11AB 15 or something. Reading further, I found this AB business meant that I couldn't really prove I was a real Linnell, but it seemed that way back somewhere there were 3 Jonathans, and only 2 of them can be properly accounted for in the Linnell lineage. Guess which Jonathan my branch of the family comes from. If my bloodline come down through a colorful character or a nefarious scoundrel, at least that would be something I could talk about, rationalize, and make comments about. But instead, I may be just James M. Linnell. These people, my ancestors, were Puritans. Went to church for a whole day, kept meticulous records about everything they did. This concept brings to mind many questions. How did they lose a whole person? Is the lacking records concerning the 3rd Jonathan accidental, or was it intentional? Do the 11AB15s really want to know the whole story? At least Rachel was being kind. She did include my name and my family in the book with an explanation that there was a better than even chance the ABs really did belong. This was not a crushing blow, but the fact did remain that my great-grandfather was a common peddler, my great-great-grandfather had been a shoemaker, and my great-great-something might not have been a Linnell. Rachel was a shrewd businesswoman, as well as an excellent researcher of the family tree. In a recent phone conversation with her, I did learn that she was pursuing an obscure reference, which might resolve the 3 Jonathan issue. For this, I'll send her another $29.95. In closing, it is with deep regret that I could not attend this meeting. It is an honor to have been asked to present James C. and Martha at this gathering of Linnell family members. It is even with greater regret that I do not have the opportunity to meet the woman whom I've grown to respect and to whom all members of the family owe a very deep debt of gratitude for the tremendous task that she has so faithfully and carefully carried out. If it had not been for Rachel's untiring efforts, much of what is known about our family would have been lost forever. It's signed James M. Linnell, 11AB15-84423.
Our story now takes us to Minnesota, the state that we could call the center of Linnells in America. Our present mailing list has some 135 households of Linnell descendants living in the state. The first Linnell to Minnesota came directly from Maine in 1860, another Samuel. However, our story tonight is about Abigail Linnell, the wife of Sherman, their sons, and Linnell, Minnesota. But listen to the story as written by Marjorie Linnell Bellow Addison and brought to us by Althea Linnell Tremune, a descendant of that first Samuel that came to Minnesota.
The Linnell marker is dedicated by Marjorie Linnell Bellow Addison. In 1985, I heard mention of the Linnell Cemetery. during funeral announcements over the Park Rapids, Minnesota radio station. My mother, Mildred Linnell Frome Peterson, and I felt there must be a connection of the Linnell Cemetery and my grandfather, Frederick Linnell, for he lived in the Becker County area during the last years of his life. We later learned that the cemetery was named for Abigail Linnell, who arrived in Becker County, Minnesota in 1880. We sent letters to the Carsonville Township Board to ask for help in locating the cemetery and to find out more about the link between the Linnell site and our family line. These letters were unanswered. We then decided to travel to the area, and we were successful in locating the cemetery on the open prairie of Becker County. It was a disappointment as the cemetery was overgrown with prairie grasses and in sad condition. The cemetery had also been renamed the Carsonville Cemetery, but this name had never been recorded at the county seat and is known as the Linnell Cemetery to this day. In 1988, we attended the Linnell family reunion on Cape Cod. 5 generations of Marjorie's family were in attendance. Returning home to Minnesota, family interest was renewed, and we talked of the possibility of placing a permanent marker at the Linnell Cemetery. My daughter Bonnie and her husband Roger Hansen made contact with the cemetery board and an appointment to meet with them to discuss the possibility of a marker. The cemetery board did find my 1985 letters in the file. We returned to the cemetery and were pleasantly surprised, for in 1985 the cemetery was overgrown with prairie grass and in poor condition. Now it was groomed and in good condition. The board had held bake sales and sold books to provide funds to get the cemetery in repair and to provide for regular grooming. We asked for permission to place a marker on behalf of the Linnell Family Association and agreed to provide sketches and copy for the board's approval. This request was granted. We involved the historical societies of the state of Minnesota and Becker County and the community of Carsonville at the dedication held July 8, 1990. The event was documented by the Minnesota State Historical Society and permanently recorded as a state of Minnesota historical and cemetery site. The date of dedication coincided with the Ponsford Centennial, an event that drew 3,000 persons, and the Linnell School Reunion that drew some 300. The Hansens produced a videotape of the centennial events and the marker dedication, filmed by Roger Hansen and Hal Bakovich. Tapes were sold to the attendees of the Linnell School Reunion and to the centennial celebrants. As mentioned earlier, the cemetery was named for Abigail Linnell. Who was Abigail? This picture of Abigail was taken in her 85th year. Abigail was a remarkable woman. Born in Canada in 1832, she married Sherman Linnell in 1853 at Rockford, Illinois. 4 children were born to this union. 3 sons, each born in a different state, and a daughter. Sherman served in the Civil War with the Iowa Cavalry. He died in 1871 as a result of complications brought on by the war. In 1880, Abigail and her 3 sons came to Becker County, Minnesota, from Iowa. On her homestead, her son, I.E. Linnell, established a trading post, and in 1883, Abigail was commissioned the first postmistress of Becker County. This gave rise to the town of Linnell, Minnesota. During Abigail's short stay in Minnesota, she moved on to California in October of 1890. She left the Linnell family name to a town, a schoolhouse, and a cemetery. Abigail died in California in 1936 at the age of 103 years and 10 months. In 1912, the Linnell Post Office was transferred to Osage, Minnesota. The name of Linnell, Minnesota remained on Minnesota maps until the 1920s. The last census of Linnell, prior to 1914, showed a population of 21 people. Linnell's attending the centennial celebration shared some memorable experiences, including the charm of a small, rural Minnesota community, appearing in a centennial parade, being a part of the first ever Linnell Family Association parade entry, rediscovering the Linnell school bell, taking part in the Linnell school reunion, and joining with the historical societies of Becker County and the state of Minnesota to place this historical marker at the 100-plus-year-old Linnell Cemetery. The inscription marker reads as follows: Linnell School. The first pioneers arrived in Becker County, Minnesota from Iowa in 1880. Trading posts were set up by Jarvie Howard in 1881, I.E. Linnell in 1882, and A.B. Hoyle in 1890. The Linnell Post Office, School, and Cemetery were named for Abigail Linnell, a widow from Union City, Iowa, who arrived in the summer of 1880 and homesteaded and later developed a valuable farm southeast of the present-day Ponsford. In September 1883, Abigail was commissioned Becker County's first postmistress. The Linnell School was named in memory of Abigail Linnell and served the community until 1957. This marker has been placed by the Becker County Historical Society on behalf of the Linnell Family Association Incorporated to the pioneers of Becker County. The Linnell School and the Linnell Village are gone, but the Linnell Cemetery and the marker are lasting evidence of the Linnell family influence in the development and the history of the state of Minnesota.
Louis Thomas Linnell was born in Lyme, New York in 1839. By the time Louis was 12 years of age, his family had traveled by covered wagon from New York through Michigan to Illinois, and in 1851, Louis was living with his family in Sauk County, Wisconsin. Louis Thomas joined the Army in Wisconsin during the Civil War as an officer. After the war, he moved to southern Illinois, where he was a farmer, businessman, druggist, banker, and real estate developer. His son, Bert McPherson, became a successful doctor of medicine in Chicago, Illinois. To bring us the story of Louis Thomas and of Bert McPherson Linnell, we will hear from Ruth Linnell Burns of Chicago. Ruth is the daughter of Bert McPherson. An artist, she designed the cover for Rachel's first book.
I never knew my grandfather, Louis Thomas. In fact, I can't even remember his name half the time. And my father, Bert McPherson Linnell, died when I was 4 years old. So that most of the, but I do remember him, but most of the stories I know about these men were told to me by relatives. The big historian of our particular family was my cousin Gussie Johnson. She knew everything about everybody, detail after detail. Rachel came to Chicago once, and I don't know how long she spent with Gussie, but must have been a long time. She came over to our house and spread out the charts. They were in roll form at that time, and they took up, two of them took up 28 feet, which is the size of my living room, and even that wasn't room enough. We crawled around all over the floor. I was fascinated by these charts. Gussie's died now, and I miss her. My grandfather was born in New York State and raised in Wisconsin. He, at 20 or so, he joined the Wisconsin 12th Regiment. I still have a newspaper that told about the 12th regiment marching off to the Civil War. I haven't done anything about that yet. I've got to do something about it. He became a major. Here's a picture, supposedly, of Lewis Thomas in his Civil War uniform. He kept diaries all during the Civil War, which Gussie donated to the University of Wisconsin. He marched with Sherman's army all the way to the sea. When his commanding officer, Byrd McPherson, was killed around Atlanta, grandfather became the ranking officer in that particular, I don't know Army unit, so a regiment would it have been? I don't know. Anyway, his troops were involved in the siege of Vicksburg. He sat around in kind of malaria swamps around Vicksburg. Somehow he managed to pick up a newspaper there, which was printed on wallpaper. And I had it for years, I read it. I've given it to the Chicago Historical Society because they can maintain things much better than I can. But it had a lovely story in it at one point that I read carefully of how to cook rats. They were under siege in Vicksburg. The grandfather was involved all during the march through Georgia. He was the ranking officer at that point. He had to whip his men, or whipped, I don't suppose he did it himself, because they had to march without sleep and sometimes even without food. We don't hear much about that part of the northern people. We hear about them living off the land and burning houses and so forth. So, I don't know, it's an odd story. He burned the diaries that had to do with the march through Georgia because when he got home after the Civil War, he used to wake up screaming every night. He just couldn't bear that whole business. So those diaries don't exist anymore. He married Isabel Longley, who's a Mayflower descendant, and moved his growing family to Cobden, Illinois, which is way down in the bottom tip of Illinois. He thought that Cobden would become another Chicago. It certainly hasn't. His oldest son was my father and was named after his commanding general, Byrd McPherson, which was a very common thing to do in those days. This is Byrd McPherson in his early Chicago days. I never saw my father looking like this. And I never even saw this picture. I don't know where Rachel got it, probably from Gussie, I don't know. My father was educated as a doctor at Rush Medical College in Chicago, where he later taught. My dentist was one of his students. I used to tell me stories about how he ate peanuts for lunch. I can't think that would be all he ate, but that's what he told me. My father was a very tall, rather portly man, very dignified. And when I knew him, but he died when I was 4, so I have some memories, but not a whole lot. But I really treasure a story that a local, wonderful woman told me about him. He was dancing down the street in this 3-piece suit with a chain across and everything. And she said, Dr. Linnell, what's going on? And he said, I have a little girl. Have a cigar, Mrs. Bloomfield. I was his first live child, born when he was 64 years old. and my brother Zenas was born when he was 66. We lived in a large house on the grounds of McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, where my maternal grandfather was the dean. Grandmother Linnell and my Aunt Florence lived with us. Fond memories of both of them. My father was a much-loved doctor. He delivered babies, some of whom were named after him. There are some Linnells floating around out there who have first names after my father. I remember that he used the anesthetic when I had my tonsils out, and he helped me through a broken arm episode. He used to come home early to play with my brother and me. During his final illness, he loved to have the two of us playing in his room. He was on the boards of many organizations. He devoted one day a week to Cook County Hospital. No Medicaid then. He and my grandfather Zenas founded Olivet Institute, a Presbyterian settlement house, where besides being on the board, he ran a clinic for neighborhood people. When my brother and I were children, we literally unveiled portraits of my father and grandfather Zenas at Olivet by yanking the curtains. We were terribly embarrassed at having to do this in front of loads of people. I don't remember my father's death, but I do remember afterwards cutting off my long curls and deciding I was going to be a boy. We had a hard time after his death in 1928. He left us investments, but 1929 came along and most of it was lost. His will canceled all medical bills, but many people did pay. 20 years or so after his death, I answered the phone. A former patient of his wanted my mother to recommend another doctor. 20 years later. What loyalty. My brother Zenas is unable to attend the reunion. He wrote to Rachel his thoughts about family and the association. Donald Swatton, a great-grandson of Lewis Thomas, will share these with you.
I suppose I should explain that I myself have never met Zenas. The Linnell that I remember is my grandfather, Lewis M. Linnell, who was another son of Lois Thomas Linnell. But here is a letter, rather than Zenas' presence, dated March 28, 1994. Dear Cousin Rachel, feels so strange to be calling you cousin, but it is true. And you can't imagine how important the Linnell Family Association is to me and the meaning of affiliation that is attached to that. As you must know, I was 2 1/2 when my father died. The tiniest memories I have of him are very dear to me. Ruth tells me he had held me on his ample stomach and hugged me a great deal when he was failing. I can't remember that, but I still feel I got a great heritage of love from him. He was said to be a very loving man and had wanted a son for so long. He was the doctor for the Presbyterian Seminary in Chicago, of which my mother's father, Andrew Zenas, where he got his name, I suppose, was dean. So my mother was allowed by the seminary to stay in the house on the grounds where we lived together. My grandfather and the other professors in the seminary took on the role of being my father as I grew up. I was so lucky to have them. Both Ruth and I feel lucky to be the chairman of the children of Bird McPherson Linnell. My career in medicine and psychiatry got its roots in studying the body and the spiritual mind. My grandfather was quite a religious scholar of my father and my grandfather. I never thought I would go into medicine, but I somehow just did. I never thought I would be engaged in studying the mind deeply, as I'm now in the midst of, but I somehow just am. Someday, you may see a book, chapters of which are now being drafted on the biology of consciousness. Roots are just amazing. No one could be more grateful than I am to my family heritage of the Linnell Zenas sides. The Linnell Family Association has a strange deja vu to my days in seminary. My special study of the mind is in the family and infant development. I'm so sorry I can't come to Granville to share in our heritage. I love the Cape Cod get-together. I want to wish you all the best in your meeting. Next time I shall be in a better position to take time away from my work. I definitely want a revised family book and whatever information about the meeting becomes available. You have my permission to use this letter in any way you may wish as to my background. Most sincerely, Zenas.
The Homestead Act of 1862 opened millions of acres of western land to settlers from the east. We will now meet Lafayette Linnell as he, his fathers, and brothers used this act to migrate westward. In the 1880s, this group of Linnells from Michigan made the move to Kansas. His story is brought to us by his granddaughter, Ladowska Linnell Elliott of Harrisburg, Oregon.
My grandfather, Lafayette C. Berry Linnell, was one of 6 children born to Joseph and Margaret Linnell in Adrian, Michigan. In the early 1880s, Leif and his 2 older brothers, Charles and James, headed west to take advantage of the Homestead Act passed by Congress in 1862. The 3 brothers settled on the Kansas Prairie in Almena Township, Norton County, in the northwest part of Kansas. Each applied for a section, 160 acres, next to one another. Then, after the marriages of their daughters in Michigan, Joseph and Margaret moved to Kansas with their youngest son, Edward. They lived with James until his marriage and then also acquired a homestead. To acquire ownership of a homestead meant at least 5 years of proving up the land with a certain amount to be done every year. This meant a lot of hard work. With the help of mules, horses, and much physical labor, they prepared the land for the wheat and corn they were to plant. Leif's homestead deed was signed on December 28, 1888 by Grover Cleveland. In January of 1885, Leif married a young Danish neighbor girl, Serena Katrina Miller. So he had the added burden of building a small sod house for his new bride, along with his proving up of the land. Here you see the family of Lafayette Linnell taken about 1905. Their 3 older children, Carrie, Josephine, and Paul, were all born in this small sod house. They're the ones in the back on your left. The 3 with a growing family, Leif built a small frame house, and there the rest of the children, Mary, Lois, George Edward, who was my father, Jay, Opal, and Velma were born. The smallest boy was my father, Edward, George Edward. Leif was a very inventive man, and so when he had the larger home built in 1904, he piped water from a cistern, which is still in use in the kitchen. The house had not only the kitchen, dining room, and parlor, but 5 bedrooms, and all had closets, which was unheard of in those days on a farm. One of the things the family often joked about was the fact that they were the only ones in the county that did not have to walk in the mud to the outhouse, because Leif had put down a cement sidewalk, and parts of it are still to be seen today. The barn also had a cement floor for easy cleaning. He built his barn so the unloading of the corn and the hay could be done under cover with a drive-through on either side of the corn crib and access to the hay mound. He built a hay stacker for loading hay on wagons in the field, and in 1908 he received a patent from the Canadian government and one from the U.S. government in 1910. Before it could be marketed, someone else had one so near the same on the market that he never continued with it. But he had the use of his original one and shared it with his neighbors. Leif loved his family and was a loving and caring neighbor. He loved young people. In the summer, when the hay mound was empty, there would be the sound of music and laughter out across the countryside coming from his barn every Saturday night. People from far and near would be there for the barn dances. John and I have visited with some of the old-timers who remembered going to them. The old barn still stands, though in sad need of repair. Leif also loved his country, and during World War I, he and my father, George, worked on the construction of Camp Funston, which is now part of Fort Riley. Paul, his oldest son, died in France just 4 months after he was shipped over. My father, George, served in the medical corps and was due to be shipped over when the war ended. All the girls married farmers, and some remained in the same area throughout their lives, and their children have remained close, settling in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. In the early 1930s, during the dust storms, Josephine and Mary headed west with their families, settling in the Albany and Scioto, Oregon area. Then in 1934, George with his family headed west and finally settled in Salem, Oregon, where he found work. Velma and her family followed in 1937 and also settled in the Salem area. Most of the children have remained in Oregon, but a few have settled in Washington, Utah, Idaho, California, and Alaska. Now let me tell you about how I met Rachel and became involved in the family association. My interest in genealogy began in 1974, but I had not been able to spend much time on it. Then in 1982, quite by accident, I found out about a letter and a questionnaire that Rachel had sent to my brother Darrell. It was passed on to my brother Paul and set aside. Needless to say, I was interested in learning more about my family. So I answered Rachel's questionnaire, and much to my amazement, I had helped fill in some missing pieces for Rachel and added much to mine. She had found my ancestors buried in the old Pittsburgh Cemetery near Rochester, New York. In 1983, John and I spent 3 delightful days with Rachel and JC discussing the book she was planning, shared information, and visited the old Pittsburgh Cemetery. It has been a joy to work with her and JC in their completion of the first edition and now her new book. I would like to express to Rachel a special thank you, and also to JC for his support of her in their time, labor, and expense to bring this all together. Without their dedication and commitment, we would not be here as one big family. A very special thank you to you both.
So far this evening, we've been meeting ancestors with the Linnell surname. As we come back east to Iowa, we look in on the Toppelmeyer family. The talented musical family of Amy Linnell Toppelmeyer influenced someone who brought musical joy to all of us. But we'll let Dan McConnell, a descendant of the Toppelmeyer, tell us the story.
This is the story of the Toppelmeyer family and of Amy Linnell Toppelmeyer and her daughter Cora and their relationship to Meredith Wilson, who wrote The Music Man. And as many of you know, The Music Man was one of the most successful and long-running musical plays in American theater history. But you might not know that many of the main characters were Toppelmeyers, who were descended from the Linnells. The story was related to me by my grandmother, Myrtle May Thorne Sewell of Belvedere, Illinois, who was the daughter of Nathan Green Thorne and Jane Linnell Thorne of Mason City, Iowa. This was also the residence, Mason City that is, of the Toffelmeyer family and of Meredith Wilson. Amy Linnell Toffelmeyer and Jane Linnell Thorne were both the daughters of Thomas Jefferson Linnell and Mary Thorne Linnell, whose pictures appear on the back wall of the Toffelmeyers' living room. I've brought to the reunion two pictures, which many of you may have seen. They're almost identical. It came to me from my grandmother. They must have been done at the same time, probably around 1880, in Belvedere, near Belvedere, in Boone County, Iowa. But the Toffelmeyer story was almost not to be. Thomas Jefferson and Mary Linnell Thorne left their home in Jefferson County, New York, in the autumn of 1845, en route with their family, then with 2 children, to Chicago, Illinois, where they were to travel overland to a new home in Rockford, Illinois. According to my grandmother, who cared for Thomas Jefferson Linnell in her own home the last 12 years of his life, they traveled in a large flatboat, bringing their own furniture, some of which is still in my family. For the next part of the story, I'll quote from Thomas Jefferson Linnell's obituary from the Belvedere newspaper of October 2, 1912. While on Lake Erie, the youngest of their children, whose name was Nathan, died on October 27, 1845, and was buried in Detroit, Michigan. When they returned from the burial, they found the boat had gone and taken their older child, Amy, with it. She was cared for by kind friends, and they found her safe when they overtook the boat several days later in Mackinac. They made the trip from Chicago to Rockford by wagon, and Rockford was their home for 6 years. In 1851, they bought and moved to a farm in Caledonia Township, Boone County, near Belvedere. That farm was on North Road, near the intersection of Olson Road and Caledonia Township. We have pictures of it, both recent and from the time they lived in it. When they retired from the farm, they moved to a residence in Belvedere at 601 East Lincoln Avenue, which was my grandmother's first home together. Grandparents' first home together upon their marriage. The Toffelmeyer family also owned a farm in Caledonia Township near the Linnell farm. Amy Linnell married John Toffelmeyer on January 1, 1866. The Toffelmeyers moved to Mason City, Iowa, where she passed away in November of 1907. But before we get to the Toffelmeyers and Meredith Wilson in Mason City, let me share with you more of Thomas Jefferson Linnell's obituary. He was a tall man, 6'2" in height, with a shock of white hair. He always stood erect and possessed a clear singing voice. He and his wife, the obituary reads, went through all the hardships of pioneer life. He was a man of great physical strength and endurance. He lived a simple, unassuming life, but left a heritage to his descendants of a clean, honest, industrious Christian life. He joined the Methodist Church in early life and was a member of that denomination for over 80 years. The Toffelmeyers, as seen in the photograph, were a musical family. Cora Toffelmeyer, who was my grandmother's cousin when they grew up together in Mason City, is seated at the piano. She never married, as best as anyone can determine, and taught piano in Mason City. She was Meredith Wilson's piano teacher through all of his early life. My grandmother always said, as did our other relatives in Mason City, that she was the model and prototype for the spinster character Marion the librarian in the musical of the Music Man. The one thing you may, and you'll have to listen carefully to know, but in the Peck-a-Little number, if you remember the Music Man, the ladies in that group, one of them is also known as Mrs. Toffelmeyer. It's probably because you like the sound of the name. That's the way the story was told to me by my grandmother in Belvedere, Illinois, about Amy Linnell Toffelmeyer and her daughter Cora.
Amy Linnell Toffelmeyer had a brother, Selwyn Linnell, who was a soldier in the Civil War. Following the war, he returned to his father's farm in Illinois. Selwyn was a lifetime farmer, always looking for and finding ways to improve his skills in farming. The story of Selwyn Linnell will be brought to us by his granddaughter, Kay Swedberg of Las Cruces, New Mexico.
If I get through this tonight, I would like to come back someday and do a talk about my mother, because I think my mother has the greatest pioneering spirit of anyone I have ever known, and I'm very proud of her. But Selwyn Clark Linnell was born in Rockford, Illinois, May 6, 1848, to Mary Thorne Linnell and Thomas Jefferson Linnell. He was one of 5 children. In 1851, Thomas Jefferson Linnell bought a farm in Boone County, and that is where Selwyn grew up. In April of 1864, a month before his 16th birthday, Selwyn answered President Lincoln's call for volunteers by running away to Chicago, where on May 31st, he enlisted in Company K of the 132nd Infantry. He was a private under Captain C.A. Lewis, and he served in the campaign of General Sherman. My mother says that he was in the March to the Sea, but I don't know if that's for sure. He was discharged in the autumn of 1864, and he received a commendation from President Lincoln for the service that he had rendered his country. Years later, from the porch of his home in Kelly, North Dakota, Selwyn and a cousin by the last name of Magoon, who had served in Lincoln's army as a cavalry officer, spoke of their war experiences. 3 of my grandfather's stories were told to me by my Uncle Russell, who had sat on the porch as a child and listened intently to the stories that his father had to tell. In one of the stories, he said that during his 5 months of enlistment, Selwyn saw action many, many times. But one night, while he was on guard duty, Selwyn heard a horse moving through the shrubbery, and knowing that the Confederates were nearby, his heart almost stopped beating. Shortly, a horse came into view, and slumped over the saddle was the body of a Union soldier. The considerate Confederates had tied the body to the horse's saddle, and sent the horse in the direction of the Union camp. Selwyn told the people on that porch that he carried a single-shot musket into battle, one that required loading with gunpowder that he carried in little bags, 1 round per bag. In order to load the gun, Selwyn had to chew the end off the bag with his teeth. And by the end of one particularly exhausting day, his teeth ached very much from having chewed the ends off of so many of the bags. During the day, the Union and Confederate soldiers were enemies, but at night it was a different story, according to my grandfather. Selwyn said that on many an evening, the soldiers of the 2 sides would go freely between the 2 camps to exchange coffee and tobacco. During the night, they were just men, all of them, tied to one another by a simple need, coffee and tobacco. After his discharge, Selwyn returned to Boone County, where he worked on his father's farm. And in 1870, at the age of 22, he purchased the farm from his father, who then retired to Belvedere. In 1872, he married Carrie Armstrong, and by her had 3 children. Carrie Armstrong died in 1889. In 1891, he married the housekeeper, Anna Johnson, my grandmother. They had 3 children before leaving Illinois and settling in Kelly, North Dakota, where 4 more children were born, the last when he was 70 and his wife Anna 44. My mother, Elsie Charlotte Linnell, was the 5th child. She was born in 1912 when Selwyn was 64 years old. This picture shows my grandfather Selwyn seated with his eldest son, Howard, behind him to his left shoulder, and Charlie Lewis, who was his hired hand and a very good friend of the family. My mother has spoken so often of this Charlie Lewis. and I got to meet him when I was 15. What a wonderful man he was. I wish we could tell more about him, but he isn't a member of the family. Selwyn was a modern farmer for his time. In fact, at that time, his farm in Kelly was the most modern in the state, according to my mother anyway. It was the first farm in the area to have electricity. In the farmhouse basement, there were rows and rows of tables with overhead electric lights. And on the tables were containers of seed sprouts used for feeding fresh greens to the cattle during the winter months. The floor of the barn was concrete and sloped so that it could be hosed down daily. The farmhouse is still standing in Kelly, though it is no longer in the family. It was purchased by the University of North Dakota professor a few years ago, and it was restored to its original condition, except for additional modern plumbing and wiring. The barn, however, was leveled many years ago, though I understand the cement floor is still there. Selwyn was a wonderful gentleman who was adored by his children, especially by my mother. According to my Uncle Russell and my mother, he never raised his voice to anyone, and he never scolded his children. All the discipline of the children was left to his wife, Anna. My mom told me that many a time, Mother would hide behind her father when her mother would come after her with a strap for some naughty trick that she had done. And as the strap whipped back and forth, my mother would peep out from behind her father. Not 1 inch of the belt ever struck my mother, but surely Grandpa Linnell must have felt the pain, yet he never made a sound. Selwyn died August 29, 1920, at the age of 72. A few years before, he had been working in the fields. His wife, Anna, and her sister, who was visiting, were driving the binders, and his son, Harold, was driving the tractor. Harold had stopped the tractor so that his father could get under it to oil it. When Anna told Harold to start up the tractor, neither she nor Harold were aware that Selwyn was not fully out from under the tractor. The tractor passed over his thigh. He lived a week before dying of uremia, and he's buried in North Dakota in Grand Forks next to his wife, Anna.
In 1801, Samuel Linnell migrated to Maine from upstate New York. Samuel and Eunice Linnell had 9 children. 5 of these children migrated west. We have met descendants of this migration living in many Midwestern states. What about those that stayed in New York? Our next story will be about a great-great-grandson of Samuel. William James Linnell entered the field of education in 1880 and devoted over 50 years to this profession. His story was written by a descendant of the Williams family, Kathy Metcalf. Kathy wasn't able to attend the reunion, and Robert Cummings, a resident of Houghton, New York, and a descendant of the upstate New York Linnell line, brings us this story.
William James Linnell, shown here with one of his early classes, was a teacher, a school administrator, and an educational innovator. He was born in 1863 in the small hamlet of Clayton Center in northern New York, near the Thousand Islands region of the St. Lawrence River. William was an acknowledged authority on rural school systems. Much of this knowledge was gained firsthand, for he belonged to that pioneer group of teachers of the 1880s and the 1890s who boarded around. His monthly salary was $12 plus board. According to William, quote, "They always gave you the spare room, which in winter was as cold as ice," unquote. He reminisced with a smile. In spite of the harsh sub-zero temperatures during northern New York winters, which frequently reached 40 degrees below zero without wind chill, Mr. Linnell felt that children in rural schools gained more from their early education than children in the city. Country children, he held, were more resourceful. His dedication to teaching began in 1880, when at the age of 17 he took over the district school in Clayton, New York. At least 3 of the 12 students were older and stronger than William, but he recalled he seldom had trouble with boys over 16. Perhaps this is why his salary skyrocketed the next year to $20 a month with board, in the third year to $28 a month, but he had to supply his own room and board from this lofty salary. A graduate of the normal school in Potsdam, New York, by 1896, William had become principal of the Granville Glen Park High School, which he organized into a union school. Among the other educational positions he held were school superintendent in Jefferson County and principal of the Cape Vincent High School on the St. Lawrence River. He had the distinction of having taught in every high school on the Cape Vincent branch of the New York Central Railroad. Too bad there was no equivalent to today's frequent flyer plan on the railroad. Much of William's energy was directed toward improving the standards of the teaching profession, including the organization of the Jefferson County Teachers Association, which became the largest of its kind in New York State. Rural and village teachers benefited from William's organization of collegiate extension work in Jefferson County. Even ever the student, he made an extensive trip abroad in 1929, where he studied the development of English elementary schools. Equally active in civic and community affairs, William was a member of the Watertown, New York Rotary Club and was vice president of the Jefferson County Farm Bureau Association. Also, he belonged to the Brownville Masonic Lodge, the All Souls Universalist Church, the Watertown Grange, and the New York State Teachers Association. He shared his love of teaching with his younger sister, Elizabeth, who also taught school in the Clayton, Watertown area for over 30 years, beginning as a young girl of 16. William married twice and was father of 2 sons, Clifford and Wells. There was a Linnell family stained glass window in the Baptist Church in Clayton. Descendants and relatives of William Linnell still reside in the northern New York region.
We return again to the state of Minnesota. In 1910, Peter Maroney Linnell took his family from Wisconsin to Cook County, Minnesota, to the area called the Minnesota North Shore. His homestead was only a few miles from the Canadian border. Here he established the community of Mineral Center. The story of Peter was written by his granddaughter, Jean Linnell Malner. Jean was unable to attend the reunion, so I will present her story. She writes, "My name is Jean Malner, granddaughter of Peter, daughter of Foster. Several years ago, I received a letter with the return address, Rachel Linnell Lynn. Now, who could this be? I had an aunt once whose name was Rachel Linnell, but she had passed away several years before, so I was sure that it wasn't her. Upon opening the letter, I discovered that we had a person in our midst who was interested in finding out where we all came from. At the same time, my cousin Gail Wallstrom was trying to do the same thing. After several letters to each trying to answer their questions, I sent them each other's name and address, cutting out the middleman, so to speak, and as you know, they did a terrific job without me. Did Linnell asked me to write something for the Granville reunion about my side of the family, so I'll try to relate some things as I remember them. As I recall, Grandpa came to Minnesota in 1910 with his 2 eldest boys, Ted and Foster, leaving Grandma in Black River Falls with the rest of the children. Why they wanted to leave the lush land of Wisconsin and settle on that rock pile that turned out to be Mineral Center is more than any of us can understand. But they had great expectations of finding minerals of one kind or another, hence the name Mineral Center. In 1911, after Grandpa and the boys had the house built, Grandma came with the rest of the children. Uncle Ted was the oldest, and when they got off the boat in Hoveland or Reservation River, I don't know which, he was to take the horses and go to the homestead. Being a young man of about 19 or so, he fell asleep and just let the horses go on their own following the trail. While he was asleep, the horses decided to turn around and go back where they came from. Now when he woke up, he found the lake on his left, and knowing that it had been on his right when he went to sleep, he thought he had circled the whole lake and was headed back toward Wisconsin, and he didn't know how he was going to explain that one to Grandpa. Those were hard times for the settlers. They wanted to farm, but there was nothing but trees and rocks, so all the land had to be cleared before anything could be planted, and everyone helped, from the biggest to the littlest. To this day, there are many mountains of rock piles, at least they seemed like mountains to me when I was little, that were dug out of the earth so that they could plant crops not for sale, but for food. There was always venison and moose meat. No one ever went hungry. In fact, during the Depression, several families moved from the big cities simply because they could plant a garden and kill a deer and live like kings. Eventually, there were about 50 families that settled there. Most of the men worked elsewhere. My dad Foster cooked in logging or construction camps, living mostly in tents. One time he arrived at camp by dog sled, late at night, and he stayed up the rest of the night putting the bread dough to rise, setting it on top of a barrel with a kerosene lamp below so that he could make fresh cinnamon rolls for breakfast and have fresh bread for lunches. He was a very popular man in the camp from that time on. Mineral Center was 40 miles from the nearest grocery store, doctor, dentist, or anything else, and the mode of transportation for several years was by horse. Eventually, Grandpa opened a grocery store and had a bear cub as a tourist attraction. He and Grandma ran the store until he died in 1928. The nearest hospital was in Duluth, 150 miles away, but the only way to get there going by the boat, America, so most of the babies were born at home, with my grandma, Angie Smith, as a midwife. This school was built by the community. All 8 grades attended in one room with the best teachers in the world to teach us, but everyone had to go away to high school. In 1937, the government bought all the land around Mineral Center and made it into an Indian reservation, and everyone left for other parts. The people still keep in touch. A few years ago, we had a reunion in Hoveland with about 300 people attending. I think my mom, Ruth Smith Linnell, was the last of the original settlers, and she passed away 3 years ago, the day after our last Linnell reunion in Minneapolis. I didn't know my Grandpa Pete. I understand he was large, about 6 feet 4 inches, and was strict and stern with his family, but well liked by all. He was energetic, honest, and a hard worker, and expected children to be the same. He did a good job because they were all of the above. As I said in the beginning, there are some things I remember hearing as a child, so please don't be upset with me if I haven't gotten everything exactly right. Maybe someday someone will write a book about Mineral Center. I know it would be a bestseller. Our program this evening has taken us through Rachel's new book, Meeting Linnell Cousins from the Cape and from Migrations Throughout the Nation. To complete the story of Linnell migrations, we come now to Ohio. In 1805, the hardy pioneers from Granville and Tolan, Massachusetts, including our Linnells, came to this city of Granville here in Ohio. To bring us the story of the Reuben Linnell family, we will hear from Ruby Patel, a descendant of Reuben and Maura Linnell.
Today, we visited the old Linnell farm on Lancaster Road, home to 5 generations of Linnells. Perhaps you wonder who of our family lived there and what they were like. This photograph, taken in 1874, pictures the family of Laura and Reuben Linnell, the couple on the far right. Reuben had inherited the property from his father, Elkanah, who built the stately brick house. Elkanah's father, Joseph, was the Linnell who had bought the land and established the farm as one of the original migrating settlers of Granville. Reuben, a strong and flinty character, had a reputation of a stern father and even a quarrelsome neighbor. Indeed, when his son Edward Payson, standing with papers in his hands, learned that his brother, Albert, on the far left, was to assume responsibility from aging Reuben for running the farm, Edward Payson issued a warning. Writing to his brother, he admonished Albert to negotiate a written contract with their tough father, specifying terms and holding parties to their agreement. That sheet of papers in Edward Payson's hand tells a story. He had graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York City and had just passed his examination by presbytery to be ordained a Presbyterian minister. His first church was to be in German Valley, New Jersey. He would be leaving Granville for good to follow his calling. In September, he would marry his sweetheart, Carolyn Johnson, here in Granville, and together they would establish their home in New Jersey. The joy of this beginning would be dashed to despair before the end of the year, for Carolyn died of quick consumption by December. Edward Payson's sister Mary, and my great-grandmother, who is seated in front, came to German Valley to keep house for Payson after Carolyn died. There she found William Norwright, fell in love, and married him. Another sister, Laura, one of twins, came next to keep house for Edward Payson. She found Henry Dufford there in New Jersey and was married also. But the same possibility did not occur for Laura's twin sister, Flora. Flora was the family artist, sensitive, retiring. When Payson moved to Montana, she found her brother's new location in the West too rigorous for her. Instead, she moved between her sisters in the East and her brother Albert on the farm, but never married. The twins are standing in the center of the picture. The bereaved Edward Payson decided to move out of New Jersey and westward to Montana, where, as a minister, he established a number of new churches. He became an executive, performing the work of a bishop and riding hundreds of miles each year in the Northwest Territory until his early death. It was said that he worked himself to death with his total commitment to all he saw to accomplish. Albert Rose Linnell, seated at the left, was 6 years younger than Edward Payson and found in his older brother a mentor. Because Albert kept all the letters Payson wrote from home and pasted them in a book, we have a record of Payson's struggles, achievements, joys and despairs, as well as his advice to Albert. These letters are transcribed and found in a notebook in the family room. In the record book also are found programs of graduation from the Granville Female Academy for the 3 girls. So much did Albert revere and adore his family that he was reading over again the letters and the programs the day he died, the 5th of August, 1927. When Albert took over the farm, an addition on the southwest corner of the house was built for Reuben and Laura. Although the entire family sometimes ate together, Mother Laura had her own pantry and cellar, for a housewife in those days took great pride in canning and preserving and pickling. Reuben lived only 4 years under this arrangement, and Laura only 2 years after his death. The problem now was how to maintain a 100-acre farm with 1 adult male, Albert, his wife Olive, 2 babies, and occasional hired hands. The others had left the farm. As soon as young Payson, Albert's son, was old enough to walk behind a plow, he was set to his chores before and after school. Plowing became an archaeological game for Payson, collecting arrowheads from the plowing of fields. It became harder to carry his farm responsibilities and still make classes when a student at Denison. When he graduated from Denison in 1912, it must have been hard for Albert to send Payson on to McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, for this meant he would become a minister, as had Edward Payson, and not return to the farm. Albert's daughter, Mary Bell, chose another direction also. She found her way to Ohio State University and into teaching, and her love of family and history has propelled us into our family stories. The farm was sold in 1927, and the Linnell presents passed to others to whom this land has become home, including the Davises, who are here with us tonight, and have most generously allowed the descendants of the Linnells to migrate through their home all afternoon. We thank you, and we thank you all for coming. Good evening.
Tonight we've had a chance to take a look at Linnell cousins and hear their stories. Now let's listen to the story behind these stories, the making of Rachel's book. We all know that such a project as a complete family story involves the work and cooperation of many cousins. Besides, it requires an individual with organizational skills and research ability and the support of her family. Listen as we hear Rachel's granddaughters discuss recollections and thoughts about their grandmother's project. Here are Emily Borland and Elizabeth Wynn, Rachel's grandmothers.
Grandmother Rachel's book we're all talking about was really started a century ago by Arthur Ellsworth Linnell. He was a good-looking man. How old do you think he was?
Maybe 30 years old. That's pretty young to be interested in genealogy. Here on the screen is a letter written by Arthur Ellsworth to Mr. Charles C. Linnell of West Haven, Connecticut on November 13, 1904. What did he say in his letter?
Dear Sir, will you kindly add the record of your family to our proposed genealogy? Please send also names of parents and grandparents. Sincerely yours, Arthur Linnell.
That's really neat. I wonder if Charles Linnell ever answered that request.
Robert Tonkin, his grandson, wrote that he didn't think the letter was even answered. In fact, that's why we have it today. Robert thinks it was put aside to answer someday when his grandfather had time and it remained for his children and grandchildren to discover. Bob says his grandfather was married in 1888. In the first 12 years of their marriage, 8 children were born to the Linnells. Only 4 of them lived past the age of 6. In 1904, when the letter from Arthur arrived, Charles was nurturing a printing business and with his wife raising 4 children between the ages of 4 and 10. His attention was on the present, not the past.
It's easy to understand that. Our parents are in their 40s now, and if it wasn't for grandmother's interest, I'm sure this kind of request would go for a long time without being answered in our family too. When people are young, they don't focus on their ancestors.
But when we really get interested in the past, some of the people who could tell us about those times are already gone.
I have heard Rachel tell about finding Arthur Linnell's research at the New England Historic and Genealogical Society in Boston. She said it was all written out by hand on individual sheets for each family. She wrote to many people to try to find Arthur's research papers. But even his grandchildren did not know what his research had been or where his papers were to be found.
Arthur Ellsworth must have known that his work would have just been put away in an attic and never used. He was sharp to give it to the New England Historic and Genealogical Society for their keeping and use. The discovery of this material really made the completion of the book possible.
I remember Rachel's story of going to Boston to find this material in April of 1981. There was a terrible snowstorm when she got to the Society Library on a Friday afternoon. She found Arthur Ellsworth's research, all of these family sheets of handwritten material, and knew they would make it possible to put together the family lines. So she made copies, almost 300 pages of these individual sheets, keeping the staff of the library there when they really wanted to leave early that stormy day.
Since the library would be closed on Saturday, she had to copy everything that very day, so she stayed until she had it all copied.
She is told of even having to hold on to walls of buildings to return to her hotel only 2 blocks away because of the violence of the storm.
And she was so thrilled with this material that she spent hours until time for her train back to Rochester, New York the next day, numbering the pages with those funny identification numbers that we have in the book. I guess this information allowed her to make connections between research already accomplished and the next steps.
I wonder why Arthur Linnell never published this material.
I think it was partly because Arthur Ellsworth Linnell's great-great-grandfather, whose name was Jonathan, remained a man of mystery. The genealogist could not establish Jonathan's parentage, and we haven't been able to either to this day.
I think he just got too old to tackle such a huge project. He was in the midst of family and business complications too.
How do you suppose he did this research? He did write many, many letters to many, many people.
Arthur was in Boston and could get to Cape Cod for the earliest records in courthouses and cemeteries and libraries. The early settlers kept very good records, I understand. And he had the ability to find them and put them all together. He wrote hundreds of letters, all by hand. Because of him and a few others, we now have a record of our story.
It was Aunt Mary Linnell who researched the Granville Linnells and those other Granville families with whom they married, especially the Roses and the Starks.
Yes, Aunt Mary loved the history of Granville. Sleuthing became her life effort in her later years. She enjoyed the societies that honored the history of this country. She was regent of her DAR and belonged to this society for over 50 years. She belonged to the descendants of the Mayflower Society, the Daughters of American Colonists, the National Society of Daughters of Founders and Patriots. Some of these I have never heard of, but they were very important to her.
Rachel says even she, when she was young, didn't really understand Aunt Mary's devotion to her research and their societies. I guess that now that Rachel is in her 70s and has done all of her own research, she can see how this is actually meaningful for Aunt Mary. It must be the sleuthing and putting it all together that is such fun, that and meeting so many cousins.
I've heard how Aunt Mary did her research. She wrote lots of letters. I've seen the notebooks of handwritten notes that she kept from libraries and courthouses. I know she took many trips to Cape Cod, Chicago, New York City, Boston, and Washington, D.C., where major libraries and genealogical information. Rachel has told us about using her handwritten notes from the books called The Mayflower Descent to check research reports of vital records from Eastham and Orleans, Massachusetts. She not only has Aunt Mary's final product of research, but also her notes of proof.
Aunt Mary's final product was turned out by mimeograph and put together in loose-leaf notebooks and given to a family and Library of Congress and all the libraries where she did research. Rachel found Aunt Mary's book at the Library of Congress when doing research. What a thrill it was to find it there.
And there at the Library of Congress was also the work of Charles and Harriet Whitney, the ancestors and descendants of Joseph Linnell, pioneer settler of Belgrade, Maine, 1638 through 1981. Rachel said she knew by this time that many Linnells had migrated to Maine, and she even had Linnell lines researched for some of them. But here it was, all organized and put into another book. So she wrote to the Whitneys about her project. They generously gave permission to use the material in the first edition of The Descendants of Robert Linnell.
Charles Whitney says that it was really Harriet who did the work for the book, that it was his help was in making it possible for Harriet to have time to pursue her hobby in genealogy. Charles tells us that Harriet died in December 1988 and that they appreciated contributing to a part of our history.
The Whitneys recorded their research and printing by manual typing and mimeographing too, even though it was 20 years later than Aunt Mary's work. Word processors and computers were just beginning to be used then. Most of the Whitneys' research was gathered from letters, personal interviews, diaries, and unpublished manuscripts. They also went to courthouses, cemeteries, military and pension records, and the U.S. Census to search out data.
So, when Rachel did her book, all she had to do was to put together all of this material from Arthur E. Linnell and Aunt Mary and the Whitneys.
Just as that would have been a huge job, but there were still many connections to be made. There were lines not in these research documents that she had discovered through letters she wrote. I kept hearing about trips she and JC took to cemeteries and courthouses, the National Archives, the Library of Congress, all over the place. One trip took her to Chicago to talk with Ruth Burns and Gussie, and on to Orangeville to see Dick and Drew. In our family, we began to see that all of this was bound to involve us, too.
And that certainly has been so. But the fact that all of us are here tonight shows that we all have become involved. All of us have answered letters, helped gather information, and talked to cousins we had forgotten about.
We found cousins we didn't know existed by coming to the first reunion at Cape Cod and to the second one at St. Paul, Minnesota. We read the names in the book. Now we can put the names with the faces. Reunions provide the time we can get together and remember. I'm glad to see my cousins every 3 years and meet new cousins too.
We tell our stories here. We celebrate family and heritage. We all have had a part. We need to remember that only as we continue to value our association will this continue for our children and our children's children.
Here's Dick Linnell, our president, out in the cemetery of Pittsburgh, New York, taking notes about the gravestones found there. Uriah Linnell, Thankful Linnell, Sarah Linnell, Zervia Linnell, and Joshua Linnell. That must be Rachel explaining it all. Much about our family is there.
It has been something to celebrate. It has been something to celebrate this night.
Yeah, that was great.
We hope you enjoyed meeting cousins out of the past as presented to you by cousins of today. When I read Rachel's book, it was a surprise and a thrill to learn that I had an ancestor who was part of Miles Standish's militia. Suddenly a story that was very distant and a story about my country became my story in a very personal way. And I think as you've heard the stories this evening, you know that the stories of Linnell are the stories of our country. When you think about the creative, innovative people that we've listened to, we can be a little smug about the accomplishments of our family. Still, quoted from the summary of Rachel's first book, there are a few stories in our family that we would rather not tell, and many that have not reached this writer to be told. Every family has its secrets. At times we have been a cantankerous lot, at times lazy and unproductive, but far more, we have been a generous, loving, hospitable, determined, ambitious, forward-looking group. The readers will add their own descriptive terms, for all have their own points of reference. To say the least, we are a fascinating family and have been productive participants in our country's history. I think that the stories this evening verifies Rachel's thoughts about our family, the descendants of Robert Linnell.
I would have to do that, you know.